Welcome to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking about how to be successful in your law school internship or externship. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan, that's me, and Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together, we're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the Catapult Career Conference. And I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on iTunes. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started.
Welcome back. Today we're talking about how to be successful in your law school internship or externship. So first, what's the difference between an internship and an externship, Allison?
Well, that's a great question. I'm not sure I even know the answer to that one. I mean, I guess in my mind, usually when you talk about an externship, you're typically talking about a judicial externship. So, I mean, this may not be a 100% ironclad rule, but typically, if we're talking about externships, you're going to be working for a judge, and that's a very common thing to do in law school, either during the summer or during the semester, and it can kind of set you up for a clerkship later. Never call yourself a judicial clerk if you are still in law school. A judicial clerk is only the person who works for the judge after they have graduated. So you are an extern, you are not a clerk. And an internship really can be anywhere. You know, it can be a nonprofit, the government, maybe even potentially like private practice. So I think that's just a broader terminology for essentially having a job that you do either in summer or in school.
I think some jobs in the government may call themselves clerks if you work at like a U.S. Attorney's office or a DA's. But again, don't call yourself a judicial clerk. That's a very specific thing. And you should figure out what they call that role and put that on your resume.
Yeah, exactly. The point is you don't want to be advertising that you are a judicial clerk for, so-and-so in the Ninth Circuit if you were still in law school, because the employers are going to be like, yeah, right.
Yeah, right.
But on the other hand, if, your position is a law clerk position in the U.S. Attorney's office for the summer, that's what it's called. But right. Yeah, you want to be sure you know what it is that you actually did and that you're careful about calling it, because other people who are higher in the hierarchy probably know what things are called.
Yeah, it's very, very true. All right, so what should we keep in mind, or I guess what should law students keep in mind when they take these first jobs? And for some law students, this may be the first time they're working in a professional environment.
Yeah, and I think that can be pretty intimidating. I mean, we'll talk a little bit later about sort of what it means to be professional. I think we have an entire podcast actually on that topic that we'd highly recommend if this is your first time sort of in an employment context. Mm-hmm. Because there's a lot to know. There are a lot of unspoken rules. There are a lot of kind of etiquette issues and things like that, not to make people paranoid, but if if your only job has been serving, ice cream at the Silly Willy or whatever, for one summer in high school, I would say, you need to do some research here. You need to be prepared because it is a pretty different environment. These legal environments tend to be more formal, even if people have had jobs, more formal than you're probably used to. So, I mean, the thing I think people need to keep in mind with this job is of course you're there to learn, but you're also there to contribute. Mm-hmm. And there's a very high likelihood that people are actually going to be relying on your work, which can be scary.
It can be scary because these aren't the intellectual exercises necessarily that you're doing your legal writing classes. These cases have real outcomes and real people involved in them, and you have to, take that seriously. I think for me, one of the things I think is so exciting about having an internship or an externship is the fact that you're in the legal world where real things are happening.
Yeah, it can be pretty cool, but it can also be kind of scary. I mean, I remember my office mate coming back and I was like, oh, you've been gone for a few hours. Where were you? She was like, I was out at Rikers, which for those of you who don't know is the prison in New York City. And I was like, what were you doing out there? She's like, I can't tell you. I'm like, all right.
Yeah. I remember when I was doing my summer job at the U.S. Attorney's Office of having a conversation with my supervising attorney on making charging decisions.
Oh, wow.
I mean, even it was just misdemeanor stuff.
Well, still, that's someone's life.
It's someone's life. And, and she was really walking me through the analysis of, I kind of said, well, I don't know if it was that big of a deal. And she's like, well, but what if this victim was your grandmother and yada, yada, yada. And she kind of went through this whole thing. I'm like, oh, you're right. But you can't learn that in law school. Like nobody's going to teach you how to make charging decisions, which is, incredibly important work. And if you're interested in doing that, prosecutorial work, that's something that you really have to deal with. But it's what makes these jobs really exciting.
Right. And then, if you work for if you do an externship with a judge, you're really going to be in the background, like seeing how this stuff happens, which can be really fascinating. And again, like it's highly likely that you're going to have quite a bit of responsibility. The judge might turn to you just like he turns to one of his clerks and say, well, what's your analysis of the situation? Do you think this evidence is admissible? Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe not if you're a first year because you probably haven't taken evidence, but, if later in your career where you have some understanding of these things, you might, and obviously the judge is going to make his own decision, but will probably take what you have to say seriously.
Yes. I think the other thing that is important to keep in mind with these jobs is, you are typically, you're not a lawyer. So you're working behind the scenes, helping somebody else. So you are, doing work that somebody else is likely going to insert into their briefs or insert into some of their work. And your job is to really make their life easier by doing high quality work that they can reference or answering a question that they have so that they don't have to do it. And I think it is important to realize that you're doing work for somebody else like that.
Yeah, like you're basically there to make your boss make their life easier and make them look good.
Yes.
So if somebody gives you an assignment, I think you have to take it seriously because there is the likelihood that they're not giving you this just for their own health. Like they actually need the answer. Mm-hmm. And so it's important, to do careful work and be thorough and kind of document your process. Where did you look? So that they come back and you go to them and you're like, well, I couldn't really find a case. Mm-hmm. Their first question is, well, what did you do?
Right.
Because they're thinking to themselves, like, I'm basically going to have to replicate this search and fill in the gaps and that kind of thing. So, you don't want to just show up and be like, oh, yeah, I couldn't find anything. Mm-hmm. Next. Yeah, exactly. that does not make you look good.
That is not, no. I think also it's important to ask questions, but remember that they don't want to do the work for you. So, you can ask clarifying questions, but, you can't say, could you outline how I should do this legal research? Because that's not really helpful. Yeah, I mean,
you have to think, like, anyone you're working for is busy, and they presumably hired you for some reason. They're not just doing you a favor by, like, letting you put this on your resume. They actually want you to do something. And they, they want you to learn. And I think one thing, to understand is fine to advocate for yourself and kind of, try to get the sort of assignments or work or areas of interest that you have, but you're also there to fit into their existing practice. And so, sometimes people come in with like this sense of entitlement, like, well, I go to an Ivy League law school and I should be given like a motion for summary judgment to write. And it's like, oh, come on.
Right.
Like, you don't know anything.
Yes.
Like, sorry.
Yeah. And the other thing that I thought was interesting sometimes at my summer jobs was they'll give you crazy needle in a haystack projects that they actually think either there isn't any answer to or that there may be some obscure answer to. And so it can be a little bit frustrating because it can be anxiety inducing when you think, I've been doing this research for hours and I am literally finding nothing. And then, kind of go to them with, your tail between your legs, basically having to admit you didn't find anything. And I remember the first time I did that, and then the attorney was like, oh yeah, I didn't think I could do that. I just wanted to see if I could. No,
I had a similar experience where they gave me like some really important project from some partner who was like, I need this immediately. And yeah, I'm like looking. I'm just like, all of the law points the other direction. Like, I mean, I don't know what to tell you. Like, there is no law that says what you wanted to say. Like, this is actually not the law.
Yeah.
And the associate who gave it to me was like, yeah, that's kind of why I didn't want to do the research, because I knew she was kind of nuts, and I knew this wasn't true, so I just wanted you to run it down, because, like, they're not really paying for you.
Yeah, exactly, so...
And he's like, oh, no one's told you this. He's like, oh, yeah, the lowest person on the totem pole probably is going to get a lot of these questions that aren't really, like, what... you're going to find stuff on. Right. And he's like, that's your job, is to like make sure there's nothing out there, but there's probably nothing out there.
Yeah, exactly.
But people aren't necessarily going to tell you that because they want you to try.
Exactly. And you should try, but you should also keep in mind that sometimes these are just wild goose chases.
Yeah. And again, like, you want to document what you did. So when that partner comes back to the associate and says, what do you mean there's no case law? He'd be like, well, this is what we did to try to find it. And, then the person who gave the assignment can either be like, oh, well, I think you should look here. Or they can accept that actually the law is not what they wish it was.
Right, which does happen, unfortunately.
Yes.
I think it's also important, especially if you've never worked in a formal office environment, to remember that when people want a draft of something, it doesn't actually mean that they want like your first draft.
Right. They don't want like your brain dump.
Right. They just mean that it's not, ready to go to a client or ready to be submitted to the court.
So, or maybe there's some questions where it's like strategy or like, oh, we haven't quite found this exact case on point. But, technically speaking, it needs to be free of typos. If you're doing citations, this is actually something you should typically ask about when you get the assignment is, at what point do you want me to like really clean up the citations? Because some people want them from the beginning. Other people say, no, leave it till the end. But you want to make sure you can easily go back and do that.
Yeah. And just remember that you're representing your professional, like, aptitude, I guess is the right word. Persona in writing. And, sometimes you're really doing these jobs not only for the experience, but for the references, or possibly, a job offer later, or you never know, but you don't want to get a reputation for being the person that does sloppy work. I mean, I remember when I was at my law firm, not to toot my own horn, but one of my supervising attorney said one of his favorite things about me working on motions was that my motions were clean when he got them. And I was, of course, doing the like motions in limine that the plaintiff size was just like throwing in to the mix or whatever.
These are not necessarily like mission critical.
No, I mean, these were not mission critical.
Questions of law.
He just wanted to file them. He didn't really want to like have to edit them and do all of that kind of stuff. But he said that was one of his favorite things about working with me. And as a supervisor, further along in my career, I can tell you when you get someone else's work that you have to redo because they weren't careful about it.
It's maddening.
It is so maddening. And so do yourself a favor and present clean work because they are going to remember that. And that's likely going to be one of the things they would say about you in a reference letter or on a reference phone call.
Well, and on that topic, one of the things you want to be sure you understand is like the firm's technology. So, and I mean, we're not talking about anything fancy, but like, can you use Microsoft Word competently?
Right. Track changes.
Can you track changes? If they tell you to accept all the changes in a document, do you know how to do that? If you're laying out like a complicated, some sort of complicated memo or something, it might be 20 or 30 pages. It's probably going to have some sort of like tables or headers or something. They're going to be auto-generating. So you need to make sure that you basically understand this. Speaking of asking questions, like this is probably not a question you want to go to like your boss with. This is probably a question you go to a coworker, someone who's like almost at your level or slightly above, and or like an assistant or secretary or like word processing or, whatever resources you have. But certainly your boss doesn't really want to explain to you how to lay out a table of contents.
Right. No, that's very true.
But they just want you to be able to do it.
Yeah. I guess another thing to keep in mind too is especially if you're not working in the government sector, if you are doing a lot of electronic legal research, you do probably want to make sure you know how the pricing models for that work.
Absolutely.
Especially in firms. There are sometimes parts of certain software that are free or easily accessible, or there are kind of some tricks, again, that people at the lower levels, those first and second year attorneys might be able to share with you some of those tricks and tips, but you should find out because the last thing that the firm wants is you charging thousands of dollars in legal research fees.
Oh yeah, and you can easily run up like tens of thousands of dollars.
It's pretty incredible. So you have to be aware of whatever they have purchased. I think usually the government programs, it's like they just buy the software.
Yeah, but this is a huge issue for like a smaller firm.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you cannot do that,
No.
So you just need to be aware of this before you start running a bunch of queries. Like talk to the person who's given you this assignment about what's acceptable to use. I mean, I know, some places they have like a certain login they can use for a certain number of searches or something. Or like, they might literally send you to like the town law library to do research because it's free.
Or if you're at a bigger firm, they may actually have law librarians that run the law library in the office, and they can answer some of those questions for you. But make sure you get those answers because you don't want that to be the thing they remember about you is you were the person who charged $10,000 in legal research fees because of some random question.
Yeah, and I think sometimes people want to use their school research logins, which is a very, very sketchy subject. Like you probably, if someone asks you to do that, I don't think that that's really something you probably want to be doing. It's not really allowed. So it's just something to be aware of that you don't think about necessarily when you're like doing your Lexis and Westlaw training or something in school, but there is a real cost to this when you get out into the real world. And, this is something that they have reference people that can help you with too. Like they have numbers you can call to, get your questions answered before you go and run that like 50 state, all cases, all courts, all everything search that literally might cost thousands of dollars.
Yeah. That was really sobering for me when I learned that at the firm, because you do get sucked in law school because you just have this wide open access to the legal research realm.
Yeah, everything. It's
everything.
all free.
It's all there. It's all there. And then you all of a sudden, get into practice and they're like, no, you can't run searches like that. That's just going to cost the client way too much money.
Yeah, I mean, that could be disastrous if you're working in a nonprofit and suddenly you just spend like thousands of dollars on legal research. Like that can't happen. So just make sure you understand the parameters. I mean, hopefully, when you show up, somebody's talking to you about some of this stuff, but people are busy and they don't think about it.
Yep.
And they assume that you understand that you can't do this.
Right. So. It's really shocking how fast I think you do forget what it's like to be green. What it's like to not have worked in one of these environments for a while because everybody's so busy. So, it is your job to look for those holes of knowledge so that you can get clarification and, and don't always bug your boss about it. Go to the people that are more your peers, or support staff can be immensely helpful in answering simple questions.
Yeah. And I think on that note, I mean, people are really busy and they're focused on whatever it is that they're trying to get done. They're not necessarily focused on you and what what you're trying to do. So let's give people a couple of practical tips of just kind of like, how do you smooth this over and sort of, make sure that you are being as helpful as you can and that you're not causing problems for people? I mean, first off, like we've talked about this before, but what do people need to bring if they have a meeting?
Oh my gosh, please bring a piece of paper and a pen or a pencil. Please, 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 please.
You should be taking notes.
You should be taking notes. In fact, you should have probably a notebook. We do deeply love our Circa notebooks that we've talked about in other podcasts, but any like a legal pad or a notebook, I highly, highly recommend that you basically never walk anywhere within the office without something to write down, because, they're going to start giving you a lot of information about a project really, really quickly, and they don't want to give it to you twice.
No, I mean, one thing I do is I often carry like index cards and a pen in a purse or something, just because then like literally anywhere, well, I have index cards and I also have like a tiny little moleskin, like teeny tiny. So then, if somebody starts talking to me and I'm like, oh, give me a second, let me pull this out. I mean, it's not ideal, but it's better than like nothing or writing on my hand.
Yeah. And I wouldn't use your phone to take notes
that just
in a
looks
meeting,
rude.
because I think it's going to look rude. And I think especially for more senior attorneys who aren't necessarily of the iPhone generation, they don't want to see you like quickly typing on your phone.
It's very visceral. They assume you're texting your friends, not that you're taking notes on every word coming out of their mouth, which you may actually be doing.
Right.
So one way, if you do have to do that to prove you were actually paying attention, is I think it's really useful and almost universally appreciated if after you have a meeting with someone, or even if it's a phone call where they've given you something to do, that you send an email recapping that. Just to make sure I understand, like, here's what we agreed to, this is what I'm going to be working on, this is the deadline. People love that.
Yeah.
Because it just makes everyone's lives so much easier.
Yeah.
Partly because you can correct any misperceptions right there. Like,
Yes.
if someone, I've given someone a work to do and they send me this and I'm like, oh, actually, you know what? That's not really what I want you to be researching. Way better. And it forces you to really clarify what the assignment is about. So I think that's always really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. It is also important to make sure that you know how you're going to answer your phone, because in
I'm just going to answer my cell phone.
I know. In an office environment, you're probably going to have like an actual phone on a desk, and people within the office are probably going to call it. And, depending on what you're doing, even people outside the office might be calling you.
You might even have to transfer.
Yeah, you
like
might have to transfer.
Someone might call you and you have to transfer them to someone else.
Yes.
Like, does anyone know how to do this who's listening to this? I doubt it.
Yeah. And so if you're not used to picking up the phone, like using your name when you answer the phone, which is a typical way to answer the phone in a law firm environment, you should practice it to make sure that you know how it sounds. And if you have, a name that is difficult to pronounce or difficult to spell, make sure you're comfortable with the way that you spell it, or, say it clearly on the phone. Because sometimes it can be difficult if somebody picks up the phone and you answer really fast and they're like, who did I just call?
Yeah, it's the wrong number. Well, and you might have a situation where you have a receptionist who then transfers you a call. So you see, they often will call on one line, you have to pick up on a different line. I mean, this stuff doesn't sound complicated until you try to do it and you hang up on people.
Yeah.
And that does not look very professional.
Yeah.
So you want to, you just want to make sure, again, like, has someone explained this to you? Do you have a little checklist of like, okay, if I need to transfer a call, like I push this button to mute it, I push this other button, I announce who it is, I push to release it. Like, I mean, it's not rocket science, but people have, I mean, at this point, like literally no conception of how the phone works.
Are you one of the people who gives like, would you pick it up and use your full name? Were you like Alison Monahan?
I don't remember.
Yeah. I've done it a few different ways. Internal, I think I always used to say, just pick it up and say, this is Lee.
Yeah, I'd be like, hi, this is Allison.
Yeah.
But now, I mean, that sounds, like, hearing that now, it sounds pretty informal. So I might have been more formal, like working in a more formal environment.
Yeah. I mean, even if you call my cell phone and I don't recognize the number, I now just say my full name.
Yeah. I just say, hi, this is Allison.
Yeah.
If anyone calls me. But yeah, I mean, the whole cell phone thing is weird because, like, you assume people know who you are, but a lot of times they don't.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, if you're whatever organization you're in, like, if you have an external call come in, somebody's got to deal with it.
And you should listen to how the other attorneys that you work with pick up the phone. Again, this is great stuff to key yourself out of. If you, especially, if you're in a more conservative, especially like an East Coast office or some government offices, and everybody's using their full names, you should not be the person who picks up your phone and says like, hey,
what's up?
Me, what's up? That's really not probably how you want to approach it. So it's really important in all of these office environments for you to, really observe what the norms are and try and do your best to kind of conform to those norms.
Right. And actually sitting in on phone calls with people who are more senior can be a really fantastic way to get a lot of really useful experience.
That's true.
I mean, presumably you're within the zone of confidentiality of whatever organization you're working in. So it's fine for them to have you in the room. You're not breaching confidentiality typically. So, oftentimes people will let you sit in on these calls, and it's actually, particularly, there'll be conference calls or they'll have the other person on speaker, and it's like really useful because you can see like, well, how do they introduce themselves? How do they sort of like do the small talk? How do they, deal with this sort of thing? So that can be a really interesting way to kind of get some experience that, isn't a huge time commitment for anyone. It's just like, hey, do you mind if I pop by your office for that call? Because, whoever is managing you just might not have even thought about this being useful. Because for them, it's just like, oh, God, I have to sit on this conference call for like half an hour. Like, could anything be more boring and tedious?
Right.
But if you've never done it, it's actually pretty interesting.
It's true.
Like, how do lawyers relate to each other?
That's very true.
I think that's one of the things you're kind of trying to figure out in these jobs is like, well, what does it mean to be a lawyer in this environment? Is this a good fit for me or not?
And it's interesting, the little tidbits you'll learn. My professional responsibility professor was a retired founding partner of a law firm in the Bay Area. And he always brought food to class. But he spent a lot of time talking about how within his legal practice, having food at meetings was one of his major tactics to kind of disarm like conflict.
Right,
and he was doing corporate defense work. So, I mean, like everybody was pretty amped up. But I thought that was just a really fascinating tidbit of, he said, it's actually studies have found that if people are eating, they're generally like happier, their guard is down,
more
it's
agreeable.
more conversational, more agreeable, and little tidbits like that, like you said, how lawyers relate to each other. I mean, I worked for someone outside of the legal field when I was I think I was like a freshman in college, but they used to go to events, and then after the event they would take everybody's business cards and write down all of the personal facts they can remember about everybody. So when they would meet these people again, they would be like, oh, so-and-so's married and they have 2 kids and they live in this place. And I found that so fascinating because it was this idea that no matter if it was all these business functions, it was important to find these like personal commonalities exactly. and I think you can see how attorneys do stuff like that because this is a profession about people oftentimes, and so it's really important.
Yeah, it's all about relationships. It's all about relationships. Yeah. I mean, speaking of, like, let's talk a little bit about everyone's favorite topic, working with other people.
Oh, yeah.
Because that's one of the beauties of the office job. I mean, so in some cases, as an intern or an extern, like, you might actually have a secretary or an assistant. I mean, certainly if you're clerking, most judges have the option basically to have a secretary or they can have an extra clerk. So most of them go with the secretary because the secretary is actually more useful.
That's true.
So, you've got to figure out how to relate to this person. And for a lot of people, I think that can be challenging. You know, you may have a secretary who's 20 years older than you are. So like, what is that dynamic?
I mean, I think the key is to treat everybody with respect. I mean, this is really like the do unto others as you want done unto you. Like, you will only reap the benefits of, besides just being a nice person, of treating all the support staff with the utmost respect and really respecting the fact that they do know a lot more than you do about working in this environment and how to practice law, really, to be honest. And they are the people who also help you when you need it, if you do treat them with respect. So respect and kindness, you know, talking to them, making a personal connection with them, offering to bring them coffee from Starbucks, like all these little things that you can do to really show that you appreciate their role. I think, you know, besides making the office a more pleasant place to be, is also just a good thing generally for you too.
You want those people on your team.
Yeah.
You know, you want to be able to go to them and humbly say, so someone gave me this assignment and asked me to file it, and I'm not really sure exactly how I would do that. Is this something that you could help me with, or could someone else help me with to explain to me? And they're going to look at you and be like, yeah, you shouldn't be filing this yourself. You know? Like,
exactly. I mean, there were times when I think I was practicing, where I would take notes from a meeting and walk to my, you know, secretary's desk and be like, hi, so this is what they told me to do in my meeting. Is this something you could say help me with? And she's like, oh yeah, no, you don't do that part. Like, I do that part. They just tell you, so you'll come to me. And I was like, great.
Right. Like, a lot of times people are just like off-sourcing it.
Right.
To you. Like,
it's
just get it taken care of.
Like, you now own this project.
Yeah, it is your job. It is your responsibility to make sure that we fax this document.
Exactly.
It does not mean that you literally have to fax it yourself. Right. Probably there's somebody else who's more capable of doing that.
But that's a very interesting point, though, because depending on where you are working, if you are in a small office and if they ask you to fax something and there's nobody else to fax it,
well, everyone needs to be able to figure out how to fax.
Right. You smile and fax. I mean,
I've spent time being paid like big firm hours to fax stuff at 3 a.m. because no one else was there.
Right. So faxing,
and it's just like, it doesn't matter
copies,
if it's your job. Like, you get it done and you get it done.
You get
correctly.
it done. I mean, that's really, it's not the time to say, like, I refuse to do XYZ.
Oh, I know. I remember someone, a young associate in the firm I worked in, almost got herself fired because she did such a terrible job making copies one weekend. And the partner is like, who does she think is going to do this? Me? You? Like, I'm paying her how much money and she can't even make copies? Yeah. Like, come on. And this girl is basically just like, whatever, like, this is not my job. And it's like, it is your job if there's no one else there who's going to do it.
Right.
And it doesn't even, it's not even a seniority thing necessarily. It's like, I had managing partners who were checking citations the day before something was due, if that's what needs to happen.
Yeah.
It's
an all hands on deck situation. It's
just like somebody's got to make the copies. And if it's you
make them right.
And like, we have the internet. You can figure out how to use the copier.
Yeah, exactly.
And it might not be obvious, but I guarantee you there's a YouTube video. If you Google like copier, like serial number, whatever, it's going to show you how to freaking make copies. Yeah. So get it right.
What about coworkers? I mean,
they can be just a whole whole can of worms.
Whole can of worms.
I mean, great if you can make relationships and whatever. I think sometimes it can be really tricky because sometimes people get like dragged into these like work complaining sessions, and people might just be venting if you're going for coffee with them or whatever, but you want to be really careful about what you say.
Yeah, because you don't want it getting back to, the partners that you are bad-mouthing the firm you're working at, or like the organization or process, or whatever, or complaining about certain people. I mean, you're really there as a guest for a short period of time, and nobody's going to fault you for being out to lunch with a certain group of people, but try not to actively participate.
Well, and you don't want to be like a total Pollyanna too. If everybody's like, oh, like this didn't go well, blah, blah, you don't want to be like, oh my God, I think everything's so great here. That's just a time to kind of nod and smile, and be like, oh yeah, I've had a good experience so far, but it sounds like there could be some issues.
Yeah, maybe just saying nothing.
Yeah, ideally nothing, but if you really have to say something very innocuous.
Just innocuous.
This is a great opportunity to practice the like nod and smile technique of like, yeah. That sounds really challenging. Well, I got to go now. I've got an assignment.
Yeah. So what about a boss?
Well, I mean, you want to interact with your boss. Ideally, you want to impress them. I mean, you may have several bosses. This is often an issue, in legal practice, is you're not even quite clear, like, who is your boss? Like, is it the person giving you the work? Is it the person supervising that work? I mean, basically, they all are.
Yeah.
you want to impress everybody upstream as much as you can.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you're just like an intern for a semester, you might not even meet like, the U.S. attorney in the office that you're ostensibly working for. I mean, I think they try to do some stuff, but
yeah. I think the thing that can be important to remember is that people higher up than you, especially if there's an age gap and the people that are supervising you, may have a very specific way that they do things.
Yes.
They may like to talk on the phone and not to send emails.
Yes.
They may like to take in-person meetings instead of talking on the phone.
They probably do not communicate by text and WhatsApp.
Right, exactly. But I think it is very important because some folks don't look out for those things, and it's not their job to conform the ways that you want to communicate.
Right. I mean, you may have a lot of ideas about how legal practice could be streamlined, and you may be right.
Right.
However, you're not going to implement those as an intern.
Exactly. So again, just observe, if this partner calls you or whoever it is, senior associate calls you on the phone to talk to you about projects because they are just overwhelmed with their email, do not you could send them a summary email, but don't start asking them questions and peppering them with emails, because that's probably not how they want to communicate.
Yeah, well, speaking of that, I think another good strategy is don't send every single question you have immediately as you have it in an email. If you're working for someone who's busy, which everyone is, you might want to spend half a day working on something and compile your questions in a list, and then you can send it to them in an email or whatever, being like, hey, these are the questions I've run into, blah, blah, blah. But it's much easier for people to address, say, 10 issues at once and to focus on that for 20 minutes and knock out your questions than to get one after another, another all morning long, because that is maddening.
Yes.
Absolutely maddening.
All right. So what about what you as a law student want to get out of this experience? I mean, what are you really looking for?
Well, I think it's a great question for everyone to ask themselves before they start. I mean, even before you accept an internship, why are you taking this job? Why do you want to have this experience? Because there are lots of different experiences you could be having. You could work for lots of different organizations. So I think getting clear on what your goals are is a good thing. I mean, generally speaking, you're typically looking for a reference.
Right.
You need someone to say yes, this person was responsible. They did good work. I would hire them. Ideally mentoring, you want to build these relationships with people. I mean, potentially you could get a job out of it, maybe at this organization, maybe at a different one. I mean, certainly for public interest work, that's a key way that people get hired long term, is they get referrals from people they were interns for who liked them.
Right.
I mean, think about writing samples. You're going to need a writing sample to apply for other jobs, clerkships, any type of job, really. And so that's something, to keep in mind. Are you getting any work that would be suitable for this? I mean, if you're just doing discovery responses, it's probably not going to be a great writing sample.
Yep.
And it is going to depend on what type of internship it is, whether that's feasible or not. But you want to make sure you've got permission to use anything that you want to use, and also that you redact anything that is should not be for public consumption, or make any edits. You probably want to have somebody at the organization basically approve whatever you end up using as your writing sample in its final form, so they can say no, you really can't put the client name in there.
Yeah, exactly.
In some cases, you can't even put our name on there.
Yep.
And then the other thing to think about is, what are you going to put on your resume after this? So you want to be tracking what did you actually do, and said in meetings all summer is not really a great line item. You want to have something that you actually worked on, ideally.
I think it's interesting, though. Some people will think, well, if I'm just there for 3 months, why do I need to track that stuff? But you'll forget. So just write it down. Write it down when you do assignments.
I couldn't tell you what I did last week.
I know.
Much less a year later when I'm trying to think wait, was that a motion in limine or was that a motion to suppress? Maybe those are the same thing. I don't know. Obviously, I never did criminal stuff. You could tell us, but...
So yeah, I mean, I think it is good to write things down and to also test out different ways that you want to track information and track what you're doing. This is a good dry run for what you want to be like when you're practicing.
Exactly. You're developing habits now that are going to go with you in your entire career.
Yeah.
So on that note, let's touch really briefly on we talked a lot about being a professional or whatever. And as I said, we've got a whole podcast on this. We're not going to totally belabor it. But I mean, what does that mean in a nutshell? What are the traits of someone who's a professional?
Well, first, you got to be competent and good at what you do. This is a craft. I mean, you're working on a trade, so you definitely need to be at the top of your game. And you want to be seen as responsible. I mean, this is serious stuff, guys.
I mean, even things like showing up on time to the office,
very important.
Showing up on time to meetings, showing up on time to phone calls. Like, there's nothing more maddening than sitting on a conference call where someone's like 10 minutes late and everybody else is sitting there waiting. Like, oh, okay, so yeah, we sent Joe an email. Doesn't look like he's answered. Yeah, anybody have plans for the weekend?
Right.
You're just burning money.
Yeah.
You're burning time.
Yeah. So you definitely don't want to be that person. You want to be thoughtful and, and kind, and just be really, aware of what your presence is in the office.
Be like a decent human being.
Yeah, be a decent human being. I think you want to be seen as hardworking and, trustworthy.
And this is really important in a legal context because you have to understand, I mean, maybe you haven't taken professional responsibility yet, but you're going to have a duty of confidentiality towards your clients and towards other people, who are involved. And so it's actually totally possible that you personally could breach that duty and give up your client's confidentiality because you are in an elevator talking about something related to a case, or I mean, you're on the Acela, this happened, someone's on an Acela talking on the cell phone about their clients, or I think in that case was actually associates they were planning to fire by name, which ended up on Above the Law. It's like, you don't want to be that person now or in the future. So you just have to be really judicious about who you're talking to and where, and realize that you can't talk to people outside of this organization typically about any sort of client work.
Right.
It's just literally not allowed.
Right. It's better to be careful and cautious about what you share.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can't talk to your significant other. You can't talk to your friends. You can't talk. You just cannot. You can't reveal things.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually a weird thing to get used to realize oh, I actually cannot talk about this.
Right.
People are always oh, how was work? What'd you do? And you may not be able to answer that question.
Yeah. It was good.
It was good. We're busy. Yeah. Working on some stuff.
Big case.
Yeah. Important things I actually can't tell you about.
Yeah. Talked to people
about stuff. Yeah. I mean, it can kind of cause problems. One other thing, I think you have to be really careful about unintentionally revealing things through hacking or something like that. You need a decent password on all of these accounts. I mean, it might sound like, oh, you're being so paranoid, but I mean, the Russians were trying to hack political campaigns. There were lawyers, and they did. There were lawyers working there, and you don't want to be the person, the intern who uses your first name as your password, and suddenly your account gets hacked, and the entire organization is exposed to whatever. This stuff happens.
And let's just make a small footnote to that too. That remember, company emails are the property of the company. And you do not want for some reason your emails to get pulled for some sort of litigation or some sort of review and have all sorts of unprofessional things.
No, if you're using a professional email account, you should only be corresponding basically with people related to your work.
Right.
You should presumably at this point have a Gmail or a cell phone or something that you can bring with you that enables you. And sometimes organizations block stuff like this, but it's you have a cell phone.
Right.
If you don't have email on that cell phone, you're just going to have to wait until you get home.
Right. Or an iPad or whatever, just don't do it at work.
And the same with, browsing the web. It's this is probably not the time to be playing your fantasy football league all day long.
Right.
It's think about what you're doing. Because, I mean, the reality is what you're doing is probably being tracked. Not for any nefarious reason, but basically because, a lot of these organizations have to retain records of what goes on. And so you just don't want to be the person who gets flagged for watching porn in the office. That is not a good way to develop your professional reputation.
No. All right. So on the porn note, I think that we should
that's
probably
a good ending, right?
Let's just end it right there.
Don't watch porn.
Don't watch porn. Don't watch porn. Okay, with that, we're out of time. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a moment to leave a review and ratings on iTunes. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. We typically release episodes on Mondays. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Allison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.